This podcast is brought to you by Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the biggest media player in Turkey and its battle with the government there. Who will come out on top? The government of Uganda, blaming the media for riots on the street. Sudan loosens the rules on censorship of the press, but the skeptics have their doubts. And Venezuela's got a problem with The Simpsons and Family Guy.
Watch.
Caracas is cracking down on cartoons. As we mentioned last week, there's a power struggle underway over the media in Turkey. On one side, the government of Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan. On the other, Dogan Yayin, a company that controls roughly one-half of all the media outlets in that country. The stakes and the numbers are huge. The government has fined the company more than $2.5 billion for alleged tax irregularities. That's almost as much as Dogan Yayin is worth. And there's a political backdrop to this story. Earlier this year, Prime Minister Erdogan urged his supporters to boycott the company's newspapers after those papers were critical of his government. Our starting point this week is Turkey and a colossal tax fine that has Turks wondering who will control the media and has Brussels asking the question, is Turkey, with its questionable record on freedom of the press, ready to be part of the European Union? When a government fines a media giant billions of dollars, that news gets people talking.
It looks like it's an attempt to muzzle a critical press.
There is a very high intolerance to criticism on all sides of the political divide in Turkey.
I share the suspicion that this may indeed be politically motivated.
There are two figures at the center of this story. Prime Minister Tayyip Erdogan, leader of the Islamist AKP party, and Aydin Doğan, the founder and owner of the Dogan Yayin media powerhouse. He controls newspapers, including the major dailies Hürriyet, Milliyet, and Posta, as well as national TV channels Kanal D and Star TV. And Doğan co-owns CNN Turk with Time Warner.
He covers the range of political opinions in Turkey, from the liberal left to the centrist and to the conservative right wing, including nationalistic ideas in Turkey.
The fact that Doğan Group owns half of the Turkish print and broadcast media is certainly a great concentration of ownership, and many people are critical that the Doğan Group has such a large stake in the media.
When Tayyip Erdogan first came to power in 2002, he and the media titan were getting along. By 2006, when Erdogan's government blocked a Doğan real estate development in Istanbul, things were heading downhill.
And thereafter, the relationship began to deteriorate. The Doğan media seems to have taken a tougher, more robust, muscular approach in criticizing the Turkish Prime Minister.
There are elements of it being a struggle between two very powerful people, and Erdogan does not brook opposition or criticism lightly.
By 2008, Doğan's media outlets were printing and airing stories about a corruption scandal, the so-called Deniz Feneri case, linking it all the way to the Prime Minister's office. Then Erdogan called for a boycott of Doğan's newspapers, and the company suddenly attracted the attention of the government's tax authorities.
Some people suspect also that Doğan might not have paid his taxes properly. But considering the fact that Prime Minister Erdogan has accused the Doğan Group for spreading lies and disinformation about his government, people think that this may have some sort of political motivation.
So there are very strong suspicions that this is designed to strongly punish and perhaps eliminate the Doğan Group as a media presence in Turkey.
Doğan's not saying much about the mega tax fine, but there are signs the company is caving into the pressure. The editors of Doğan's two largest print assets, Milliyet and Hürriyet, have been replaced. Other media groups have been strangely, perhaps tactically, silent.
Some of them are fearing that the turn may be theirs in the future, but some may be happy to see their greatest rival disappear. If, of course, it's going to disappear at the end of this process.
Should the Dogan group collapse, there is a real possibility that the significant media assets of the Dogan group could be redistributed by the Turkish authorities to more friendly groups in Turkey.
Keeping a close eye on all of this is the European Commission. Opponents of Turkey's application for EU membership have criticized the Erdogan government for repressive media laws, and Erdogan's treatment of Dogan will do nothing to alleviate that criticism.
The EU Commission has made a declaration saying that this fine is against press freedom, and suppression of press freedom in Turkey does not go so well with Copenhagen political criteria.
I think there is genuine concern in Europe and indeed in the United States. Nobody's trying to interfere in the tax-related issue, but there is some concern about what's seen as a sort of drift towards slight autocratic tendencies in the Erdogan government.
However, the EU might want to look at the bigger media picture in Turkey. Is it healthy for a country, any country, to have more than half its media output in the hands of a single company, a company that also has major stakes in energy, manufacturing, trade, and tourism?
According to surveys in Turkey, only 25% of the Turkish public have any trust in the media in Turkey, and it's precisely because of the direct interweaving of media interests with commercial objectives and political considerations.
So what's the solution? In this case, there actually is one. It's called regulation.
The government should curb this concentration of ownership, and for this to happen, I strongly urge the government to pass legislation to ban cross-ownership, which means media owners should have only radio and television and not newspapers.
Instead, politicians like Tayyip Erdogan use the carrot and stick approach, wooing big media with carrots when they get good coverage, and when they don't, giving them stick. In this case, $2.5 billion tax dollars worth of stick. Here's how our Global Village Voices see the media story in Turkey.
$3.5 billion sounds huge money. I don't know how it's been calculated, whether it's more or less than the tax they originally owe. Yeah, I heard the news last week on radio. Thinking now, it must be difficult to collect taxes during financial crisis.
I think this court case is going to be a test for Turkish democracy. I do fear that there will be no winners in this case, because if no pure facts are shown, it's going to look like a bias and the argument between the secularists and the pro-AKP. But it is going to be a testing point for the Turkish government and for Turkish democracy in general.
If you'd like to join our growing list of Global Village Voices, you can let us know by emailing us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. But most contributors just go on Facebook and hook up with us through the Listening Post page there. We have more than 2,200 viewers now signed up. You can also follow us through Twitter. We will let you know via Facebook and Twitter what stories we're working on and how you can add your voice to the mix. We're going to take you to Uganda in the second half of the broadcast, and our News Bite section is also heavy with media news from Africa. The president of Sudan has ordered the immediate end to state censorship of the media. President Omar al-Bashir, still wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes in Darfur, made that announcement via Sudan's official media outlet, the Suna News Agency. Suna reported that the pre-censorship system by which the authorities would screen newspapers before their publication is no longer in force. The change was made ahead of next year's parliamentary and presidential elections, Sudan's first in nearly 25 years, but not everyone buys the move as genuine. And the deputy editor-in-chief of Sudan's Ajaras al-Hurriya newspaper said, quote, "There is no way they," meaning the government, "are going to tolerate anything about security or about the International Criminal Court," unquote. The Kenyan government is proposing to limit access to the country's crowded airwaves, and private media owners are not happy. Under a new media law, the government wants to limit all private broadcasters in television and radio to just one frequency, one channel. The new rules would not apply to state-funded broadcasters. Private media owners say the law will pave the way for a virtual public monopoly of Kenya's media. The government has also announced that local channels will make the move from analog to digital broadcasting in Kenya in 2012, which is fine for viewers who have the right equipment, but not so good for Kenyans with older television sets. Across the Atlantic now to Central America, the government of Honduras, which was installed after a coup this past June, has issued a decree allowing it to suspend freedom of speech, ban political demonstrations, and suspend media groups for what the government calls, quote, disturbances of the peace, unquote. The move follows the return of the ousted elected president, Manuel Zelaya, to Honduras. Zelaya has taken refuge in the Brazilian embassy in Tegucigalpa. The new military-backed president, Roberto Micheletti, has shut down Radio Globo and Cholusat Sur, two stations that have been critical of him and the government. There's been a bit of a brouhaha in Britain over a recent BBC interview with Prime Minister Gordon Brown. The interviewer, Andrew Marr, asked the Prime Minister a question that's been speculated upon in the right-wing blogosphere.
A lot of people in this country use prescription painkillers and pills to help them get through. Are you one of those people?
No, I think
that Brown had been taking antidepressants to deal with falling poll numbers and the pressures of his job. Brown's supporters said Marr's question was out of line. BBC watchers say they detect some signs of a move to the right by the state-funded broadcaster. They point to the Brown interview as well as a debate that the Beeb has coming up that will include the far-right leader of the controversial British National Party. One of these days, we're going to do a story on a new film called South of the Border. It's the work of the American director, Oliver Stone, about Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez and the way he's been depicted in the U.S. media. But Chavez has some domestic media issues of his own. Last year, Chavez's government forced the American cartoon series The Simpsons out of prime time and into a late-night spot after the show was deemed inappropriate for children. Now comes word that another popular animated sitcom from the U.S., Family Guy, has been banned from the Venezuelan airwaves. Chavez's justice minister took exception to an episode that he said promoted the illegal use of marijuana. If he's not careful, President Chavez, who has his own talk show called Allo Presidente, might find himself the only animated character left on Venezuelan TV. We're back after the break with a piece on Uganda, where the media have been blamed for political unrest. Welcome back. On one of our first shows here at the Listening Post back in December of 2006, we reported on the changing media scene in Uganda under President Yoweri Museveni. Way back in 1993, Uganda had just one radio station. It was state-owned. But by 2006, the country had 140 privately owned radio outlets that were broadcasting a wide spectrum of voices that state-run radio seldom heard. Fast forward now to the events of the past month. Presidential elections are coming up next year, and the incumbent is locked in a battle with the king of the country's biggest tribal region, Buganda. The conflict has spilled into the media, and President Museveni, once credited with opening up the airwaves, has now silenced 4 of the most popular radio stations in Uganda, and his government stands accused of torturing a well-known journalist. The Listening Post's Salah Kadar now on the changing mediascape of Uganda and the new threats to journalistic freedom in the run-up to next year's elections.
The protesters fought with police from behind barricades and burning tyres. Stones in one direction, tear gas in the other.
Some unlucky people ran right into a group of security men who were chasing pedestrians they found on the street.
When riots broke out on the streets of Kampala on the 10th of September, pictures of the clashes were beamed around the world. And whilst the Ugandan security forces cracked down hard on the demonstrators, the government cracked down just as hard on national TV stations, pressuring them not to show pictures of police brutality.
I think that they are very sensitive about that, because if the TV stations and journalists had not filmed, policemen and the army beating up innocent civilians who were just walking on the streets, nobody would have known what was happening in Uganda. They would have just thought, well, riots, evil people. But I think that therefore the tables were turned on government because of the media. The media exposed these injustices.
A According to the government, however, the media was adding fuel to the fire of people's unrest.
The violence and lawlessness was preceded by inflammatory and sectarian broadcasts from various radio stations, which systematically incited listeners to cause chaos and destruction wherever they could.
4 radio stations were ordered shut, and Robert Kalumbi Serumaga, a radio talk show host, was arrested and kept in detention for 4 days.
Robert Serumaga is a highly respected and influential journalist in Uganda, and it's very clear that the government did not want him to be giving his interpretation of what happened over those 2 days. He was detained by government agents following a radio program on the 11th of September. He was beaten, and he was physically assaulted by these people, forced into a car, taken to an illegal centre of detention in Kampala, where he was held with around 20 other individuals who had been picked up during the demonstrations.
Serumaga was charged with 6 counts of sedition. Fortunately for him, a previous case brought against the government by independent journalist Andrew Mwenda has put Uganda's sedition laws under constitutional review, and Serumaga was released on bail.
The laws which are being used are very archaic, very old-fashioned, really primitive laws. Some of them come right from the colonial times. And right now, most of the journalists are being charged with sedition. But they are fighting back.
Serumaga and Mwenda may have escaped sentencing, but President Museveni did achieve his aim of sending a powerful message to Ugandan media.
The media as a whole have been curtailed. No reasonable discussions are happening on radio at the moment. It's got to tug a specific line.
It's evident that Mr. Museveni doesn't like alternative points of view or challenges to his authority, and in this instance we've seen, I think, a pretty aggressive reaction by the state, when in fact we need to see an investigation into the actions of the state itself.
I think what we're seeing right now is that Uganda is becoming, very fast becoming a prison for journalists. In fact, I've had one of the journalists telling me that they think that President Museveni is competing with Robert Mugabe as to who can be more brutal and more repressive against the media. What's happening in Uganda right now is very symptomatic, very similar to what happens everywhere across Africa.
Almost every African leader who clamps down on the media cites the chilling example of Radio Milcolin in Rwanda. In 1994, the radio station played a key role in inciting violence by the ethnic Hutu against the Tutsis.
This was basically an extremist radio that openly called for killings. We had open calls for people out on the streets to go and kill Tutsis.
Rather disturbingly, members of the Ugandan police have been telling us that their concern about potential Rwanda situation is behind some of their decisions, which we find quite concerning.
But media professionals are becoming wise to this tactic. During the violence in Sierra Leone in March of this year, 2 radio stations were also shut down for incitement.
If we look at what happened in Sierra Leone, we saw something similar, where journalists were arrested, where we had media outlets that were threatened because they thought that they were perpetuating and inciting youths to go on the street and cause anarchy.
The thing that has been most touted about is the function or the action of the Radio Milcolin in Rwanda that led to the genocide. And we feel this is nothing but scaremongering that governments across the continent are now using as basis to shut down radio stations.
But given the freedoms that Ugandan media have become accustomed to, President Museveni's clampdown may not play out exactly as he hopes.
The president now thinks that the best way is to clamp down further and take away licenses and stop these stations from performing. He is making a very big mistake. It will just backfire.
If it doesn't allow the media to actually have the ability to do their job, then we're going to have outlets who are prepared to go the extra mile and do things clandestinely.
Apart from the media becoming more solid and strong and determined to expose the bad and the injustice, we are going to see the people themselves start rebelling against the government. And they may tell their views during the elections come 2011.
And until those elections, just how much freedom the Ugandan media will get to report the important issues remains an open question.
More Global Village Voices now on the state of media play in Uganda.
I think this is not new development. Previously, radio stations, newspapers have been clamped on and journalists arrested, especially radio and mostly print. So it's not really new. I believe there's free press in Uganda. Compared to all the East African countries, Uganda ranks best in free press.
What we in the West often fail to grasp is that as much as we would wish, our concept of a free press does not always easily translate into Africa. While the pen may be mightier than the sword, it's an individual that always wields it. And in Africa, that individual needs to be a very brave man indeed.
Finally, we usually end the show with a web video that packs a message about the media or politics, but this week, it's all about the visuals. Two graffiti artists, David Ellis and someone who goes by the name of Blue, got together recently in Italy, and they collaborated on a mind-boggling piece of work. Graffiti is an urban art form. In this case, it's been brought to life through the use of stop-motion animation and brought to the world through the user-generated wonders of YouTube. This is our web video of the week. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.